Hello everyone, today we talk about the medieval tradition of Iberian law, continuing up to the Renaissance essentially. We stop in the 16th century. This is interesting because, as we've seen often, the Iberian Peninsula is an autonomous and an original, independent almost system compared to other parts of Western Europe. I would say that the macroscopic reason, of course, having been centuries of Islamic domination. And so a moment of important the modulation, remolding of certain, political and cultural bases that escaped, in a sense, for example, the relative homogeneity existing in post-Carolingian Europe and what emerged from there. Just the other day, I made a video about Castile and Aragon, highlighting the precocious, by the way, drafting of the various local legal customs, as much as the important difference existing between Castile and Aragon, and also, of course, other parts, not just of the Iberian Peninsula, but the same ones dominated by the two major monarchies that were particularly composite in their birth, in their beginnings. This is particularly true for the Crown of Aragon, but also Castile, as we've seen in the videos from the historical regional series, was put together, in fact we say Castile for the sake of brevity, but from different provinces, different backgrounds, and you have, especially in the Castilian case, the affirmation of the larger system that sort of shifted rapidly in the 11th century towards the south, with Toledo. That was a bit like the key to all Spains, if you could use the plurality of it, and that had, in fact, to take care of a vast array of different communities that were also substantially different from the ones of the northern conquerors that had, again, been also sort of more primitive, less sort of civilly advanced, and coping with a tradition which, of course, had was not merely just like the Islamic government had always been ruling over large amount of people had remained Christian, and not only, but the local tradition of the country had been in part Roman, in part Germanic, and there is a continuity in different parts of the Iberian Peninsula, in fact, some legal customs that date back to late antiquity as well. Remember that before Spain was taken over by the Arabs, there was, within the Iberian Peninsula, a very autonomous church, of course, in the same Toledo, very famous because of its councils, that basically were inspired to Constantinople, right? They were also competitive with Rome, like even if we're talking early medieval times, so there wasn't quite the coordination that would have occurred with the Gregorian reforms. In fact, there was also, in the few parts of Spain that remained firmly in Christian hands, governmentally speaking, all negotiation with the papacy to adopt, for example, the Roman Rite as opposed to the Visigothic one. There were importantly different paths that this land took compared to the West. But there are also some important, in fact, continuities with the saint that we will highlight today as well, right? So, the Christian communities of the Iberian Peninsula were, in many ways, by the 11th century, that is when we start now, with some retroactive, consideration from the migration era and so on, were the future in many ways. They had received an important Frankish support. They were essentially structuring themselves in the Western feudal fashion, and this also entailed a particularly structured and built up sense of the institutions, of the records, of written culture, and in fact of the importance of the communities right, that in the Islamic world had been conceived as much more sort of subjugated. This is not to say that they lived necessarily in in particularly worse ways. Actually, that the more developed part of the Iberian Peninsula, of course, was the south, but they were, in terms of local autonomies, at least much less regulated, because at the end of the day, the command over these centers, mostly we're talking cities, right? The more south you go, the more that's the case. But that had appeared a bit like the rest of the Islamic world, the Islamic-dominated world, fundamentally deprived of that, say, spirit of autonomy, of room for maneuver, simply because of the reason of that many of these people were Christian themselves, right? So there was also a militarized context with the frontier with the same north. There was an attempt to deprivate these communities of further autonomy, because this would have meant having easier contact with the Christian enemies in the north. So there are a set of reasons that are not easily summarized in a single video only, but we'll talk about this. Today we talk about rather what was happening on the other side, which is in fact as a consequence, the documented one. We couldn't say the much better documented, in some cases probably the only documented one to occur, right? Of course, the Reconquista itself was in some ways a war of invasion, rather than one of liberation in absolute terms. The north of Spain had actually been always quite different from the central, the southern part anyway, right? In Visigothic times, the northerners were the barbarians that were always harassing the frontier. They didn't want to be brought down. So this also, as a war, as a general destabilization of the south during the Typhus period and more, is to be appreciated, right? The caliphate the caliphate right, it sort of extinguished itself by itself, right? At some point, they literally sit at a table and said, look, the caliphate is over. This is not a universal empire anymore, because we failed, in fact, in the eyes of God. And so you can almost perceive that exhaustion. You can perceive that sense that the Frankish West, broadly meant, was now advancing with much fresher and sort of also more elaborated forces. Latin Germanic Europe sort of progressed apparently more gradually during the early Middle Ages, in terms especially of statal bureaucratic forms, but it actually sedimented a quite bulky basis that managed to overwhelm, in fact, also the Byzantine, the Arab world. And one characteristic of these Christian Iberian communities was, starting from the end of the 11th century, the drafting of their own customs, right? Remember, this video is about law, so we're going to talk mostly about this. And it's important to observe how these customs were collected in some, in fact, summa that were eventually approved by the local prince, and that took the name, we've seen it recently, and this is also notorious, European history, of furos, right? The term could vary. The Catalan part called them customs or furs, and in any case, they meant essentially a legal collection that, importantly enough, was the one of the local principality, right, of the various areas. So this was not a unitary system. Like, it wasn't stemming, I don't know, from an homogeneous Visigothic background, or an homogenized Christian but still under, say, Islamic rule type. No, the Iberian Peninsula was quite fragmented, quite different within its parts, and also quite competitive, notoriously also within the same Christian, among the same Christian principalities. And so it was particularly important to define what was the custom of that land. Think about the Ebro Valley, right? In fact, this area had been much more Romanized, or more open to Frankish Europe. It had maintained paradoxically, even if it was one of the most decentralized areas in Visigothic times, it was sort of always rebelling because it was more Roman in nature. Actually, by this point, a Gothic identity, because that was at least preserved there as part of what had been the Visigothic kingdom, given the fact that they were decentralized from the same Islamic rule that at a point had been exercised also on that. I made a few weeks ago a video about 10th century Catalonia explaining this and how they were sort of coping with being in between powers like the Ottonians, the papal spirituality, the caliphate, etc. So in the 12th century, you have a strengthening of the feudal monarchies that brings these, also with the advancement of the Reconquista, these powers to need an ever greater effective and homogeneous legal system, so that the Count of Barcelona had the collection of the city usages as well as the one of the surrounding region drafted, and this legal collection took on the name of, in fact, Usages de Barcelona. In Latin, or Usages de Barcelona actually, in Catalan, Usatici Barchinione in Latin. This, of course, shows you, especially in a region like this that was more commercially dynamic, right? It had greater transactions, right? More maritime trade, also sort of, in fact, more external influences as far as trade rights, interaction with other countries and so on. Also quite advanced ones in commercial activities as well. The necessity of having a firmer, written code that you could make a reference to. This is pretty much the normal trend in Europe, right? This video actually is in parallel with the one, especially about the spread of Roman law in Italy, France, and Germany. And we have observed how essentially it's the Italian communes that were at this point in quite intense contact with Catalonia as well, leading the path of juridical production, recovery of Roman law, right? That they would be the model that, in fact, the same, not just the same Catalonia in this case, but pretty much all Western Europe adopted later. This aspect must not be underestimated, because there was a strict cooperation also in the Reconquista along the Mediterranean coastline with the Italian maritime republics, in fact, the Aragonese armies on land. So that's quite relevant. And the fact that the Usages de Barcelona are the first bigger drafted code is not a coincidence within the Iberian landscape in general. You have, however, further collections of territorial customs drafted in Spain in the following century. In Aragon, in 1247, you have the approval by the Cortes gathered at Huesca, the text of those common customs to all the territories of the Aragonese kingdom. That, as we've seen, was a complex thing. In these Cortes, as we've seen recently, the main participants were the noblemen, the clergy, and the communes. The Cortes were presided over by the king, that was the one who had, of course, to eventually enforce this law as well, to protect it, and that traditionally was called, just in his office, to defend, to protect these communities and their customs. And this 1247 text, which was handed down to us in two manuscript traditions. First one is the Compilatio Minor, also known as Fueros de Aragon or Código de Huesca, in 8 books. These were pretty sizable, as you understand. And the Compilatio Major, known also as Fori Antiqui, Liber in Excelsis Vidal Major, in 9 books. For the record, Fueros etymologically comes from forum, right? So it's interesting that the Iberian tradition, the Roman customs had somehow remained as a sort of paradigm of civil, memory in that past, even though these customs had severely changed, as we will see now from them. There was instead no collection of the general customs for the other kingdoms of the Crown of Aragon, right? Catalonia, in spite of the customs of Barcelona, did not produce one, nor Valencia. You have instead, in the Kingdom of Castile, during the 13th century, 3 collections of laws published by the monarchy. The reason why of this difference is that you needed a more precocious regulation as far as we've seen Catalonia was concerned. The Aragonese are mostly concerned instead with, like a bit the Castilians, establishing some broader statal feudal fundamentals, right? So they, especially Castile in the 13th century, overexpands, as you know, towards the south, so it needs these legal collections to be drafted, arguably more than the quite composite crown of Aragon, more heterogeneous crown of Aragon. Right? You have these 3 collections. There are the Fuero Real, the Especulo, and the Ley de las Siete Partidas. The function of these collections, their juridical philosophy, was similar to the ones that we observed years ago. I have in part to re-upload those videos with better images, but the info is always there as far as the explanation is concerned. The Kingdom of Sicily was concerned regarding the Assise of Ariano and the Liber Augustalis, right? In other words, Castile, similarly to actually Sicily, the most centralized of all the Latin Germanic kingdoms from a political, juridical point of view, had as its main objective, through royal law, to integrate the discipline of the local customs, essentially eliminating those norms that were considered as surpassed and even against, like at least incoherent with the higher principles of equity and rationality. The legislative collections of the Castilian king were thus carrying out this function towards the local fueros. This was not, even the Kingdom of Sicily went as far as saying that that's the extra step that no other kingdom traditionally took in the Middle Ages. That is, not only this capacity of discriminating essentially between those laws that were sort of enforced, logical, adhering to natural law and what these communities developed. Of course, it was always a necessity of acceptation from the side of the communities. So that tells you how, in fact, in the ancient regime, there was never such a thing like an absolute law. That actually comes with the Napoleonic era, with the state as the sole source of law. You had, in Sicily at least, the creation of new laws that were considered to be fitting, like they could be accepted within the local customs, that were king's made, right? And there was, in that case, even a sort of a hint to divinity. They were talking about Frederick II, the last guy who used, the attributes of the Sol Invictus and so on. So Holy Roman Emperor and beyond. Castile had a very strong monarchic power, so they go as far as basically the Sicilians, except for the last step that distinguishes the latter. And in fact, Castile, as we observed also the other day, would develop as this is the cause / consequence at the same time of a particularly compact realm, right? The most important of the three aforementioned legal collections, let's stress royal legal collection, the Kingdom of Castile, was the Ley de las Siete Partidas, that was promoted by essentially the greatest legislator in medieval Castile, that is Alfonso X, ruling between 1252 and 1284. Made multiple videos about the guy. Still haven't delved into properly in the juridical mass of his reign, production. But this is just for pointing out where this most important collection comes from this great legislator. And the name takes, it simply means the law of the 7 parts, because this law is divided in 7 parts, and it shows, by the way, a remarkable influence of the Justinian and Roman law, which is definitely not strange, given that at this point you had the full development of not just Romanistic studies in Italy and from Italy to Europe, but also the peak of universalism in the Middle Ages. Alfonso X is the same. He has a Swabian blood. He has universal ambitions, both in the Holy Roman Empire, also in Spain, even North Africa. And so there is all an effort from his side to push essentially the great rulers of especially this time, the slight time before, especially the Hohenstaufen, to stress what essentially had been at the root of the Byzantine ideology, Justinian and essentially Theodosian law, that is the subordination of the church to the state, and pretty much everyone in the process, so the state as the king in this traditional world. And so the coming back to an ideal absolute of public authority stemming from the Roman and Germanic tradition, such as the fact that, again, that there was a public demand. It was not fragmented actually in the feudal wave, not because the king had decided so, because everything actually belonged to him, as God had given him the right to rule over it. And of course, this was a way to enforce a certain idea of statehood as well, in a time in history in which great feudal monarchies were building up. And these are essentially in Europe, France, England, essentially the Iberian monarchies, especially Castile, Sicily, right? And there would be ups and downs. Every country had a different story and a different way to it. Castile, as we were noticing in the video the other day, also was not perfect in itself. There were some moments in which the monarchy failed in a political sense, right? It seemed as if the kingdom was to fall apart. This is not really what happened, for example, in France, in spite of the 100 Years' War later on. But it's also remarkable that Castile still managed to stand on his feet, in part thanks to this, in part thanks to the fact that actually it was much more of an oligarchy than, for example, the Crown of Aragon. And so even if the oligarchs quarreled, at the end of the day, they were also top elite that just by marrying to each other in the same royal house, they would keep up with this feudal monarchy that would develop further to, as it was already actually the strongest Iberian one. these were the heroes, the greater heroes of the Reconquista, the ones who had seized the most, Cordoba, Sevilla, right? They had ambitions on the Straits and more. So it was equally important from a political and strategical point of view, having strong laws to regulate the entire system, to keep it together. And truly, the authority of the Castilian king was much more brutally impacting than, for example, anything that they had in the Crown of Aragon. So we have to bear in mind that as the foundation of the local and regional customs of the Christian communities of the Iberian Peninsula, we find the Visigothic collections, and consequently also an enormous deal of Theodosian Roman law. Right? I made some videos about the Breviarium Alarici, the Burgundian law, the Lex Romana Visigothorum, the Lex Romana Burgundionum, etc. We observed how essentially the Burgundians and the Goths had the single most radically Romanized laws of all the Germanic peoples that in many ways are sort of exchangeable with the same Roman law that had, at least in the way it had customarily developed in the Western Roman Empire. You know that essentially when we talk about Roman law in the Middle Ages and in modern era, we're talking the Justinian Code that was again put back together, not even by the Byzantines, because there also things had sort of collapsed in a way, but by again the Bolognese Studium, the Italian humanists, and this in turn was historically based on the Theodosian law. It was actually Theodosius who created the, say, Roman law in late Roman times, put together all the jurists, because the Romans had their own law as a common law, which is, at least it may sound paradoxical, because eventually we distinguish between civil law and common law, exactly because civil law is the one coming from the Roman tradition, because eventually Rome became an empire, had this greater sense of public authority and more, but originally it wasn't quite like that. In any case, those who instead at the time, late antiquity, put back the Roman law together were the Eastern Romans. And when this happened in Theodosian times, so technically when the empire was still all together, like with the West, then eventually there was the Justinian and Reconquest, and lots of things had changed in the meanwhile, properly in the Roman customs and the type of law the Romans used to discipline themselves. So Justinian issues his Corpus Juris Civilis, and there is a huge debate how much does this actually circulate within the West, and the answer is very few. So much that it has to be again recovered by these jurists and philologists in the later Middle Ages. And so when we look at the Visigothic law, we realize that even though they had been inspired to the Theodosian law, they were actually following a pattern of a hybrid pattern of mix of sort of Germanic laws, but mostly the same Roman one. And there is a debate also regarding whom this law was directed to. The answer is practically to the entirety of the population, rather than just the Goths, the Burgundians. And it's also interesting that at the root of these medieval Spanish collections, there is not just the Visigothic law, but specifically the Breviarium Alaricanum, which is technically not, at least according to the most updated studies that now are basically considered to be right, with broad consensus, not a Visigothic law, but actually an Ostrogothic one, right? One that had been issued. It was called Breviarium Alaricanum because it took the name from Alaric II in Spain, whatever, but it actually had been adopted by, say, from Theodoric's Italy at the time, in which essentially the Ostrogoths had the protectorate over Spain. And because that was actually, like, the Ostrogothic Italy, the most still juridically functional country in the West, right? And also the one that had experienced the best Romano-Germanic integration in Ostrogothic times. So this Spanish customary law is the product of a quite broader late antique tradition, right, in the West, right? It's not so rigidly specific of the same Iberian Peninsula at the root, but of course, and this is the point, it had evolved, right? Here we're talking almost a millennium later, those laws had been issued. And they had been modified, just like, I don't know, the Byzantines in Italy, before being taken over by Longobards, had a Roman law that was in theory deriving from the Justinian one, but surely wasn't at all that, because they didn't have that, the corpus juris civilis actually circulating, being employed. So every country during the Middle Ages the early Middle Ages had sort of shrank to a much more customary organization based on the specificities of their society. I made some videos about Visigothic society. It was incredibly unequal in many ways, and differently from other peoples. And this is actually showing a continuity with late antiquity that other countries in Europe, for example, did not have in the same way, at least especially from a juridical point of view, right? And in the 13th century, what happens in Spain is that the local juridical studies activate to receive the now re-edited, reconstructed, restored Justinian law, enriched, plus now by the interpretation of the Bolognese doctrine, right? So this is, of course, something I made multiple videos about the Italian tradition. This is again the model that is employed everywhere in Western Europe for the study of law. There is a widespread adoption of Roman law, independently from what had been the traditions, the ethnic traditions of the countries, because these are just now like not just more advanced, like to the level of social complexity of what had been the Roman Empire, but even enhanced by actually the progress of the medieval civilization. That, especially as we were saying before, as far as commerce, transactions, etc., the Bolognese doctrine had expanded dramatically with an incredible bias for practical use, right? So the Spanish adopt this law. Naturally, they also, this as far as civil law is concerned, they also adopt a lot of canon collections. So they pick the laws of the church for the Spanish church that also that had been developed by the papacy in Italy in parallel with the Bolognese tradition, and they had been compenetrating each other in terms of complexity, of richness, of the institutions, and more. And so this is adopted fundamentally in Spain. In the 13th century, you have a studium generalis established, famously enough, in Salamanca, that would be, in fact, the single most important university in Spain, henceforth, by the King of Castile, Alfonso IX, in 1218, which is fairly early, right? Especially properly in this royally sort of dirigistic affirmation, like the fact that this had to become de facto the Studium Generalis of the King of Castile. This is the same one that, I don't know, judged Columbus later on, regarded. It was really a pool of science and juridical science, primarily because, again, what these studia were created for, I made lots of videos about medieval universities, of course, was law, was government, right? And the relation between Roman and canon law from one side and local customs on the other takes on, in Spain, very peculiar forms. In the Kingdom of Aragon, the customs of Lerida in 1228 established that in the absence of a city norm, so this in the Aragonese kingdom could be an Aragonese city and one of the here, I think it was within at least within continental Spain, the continental possessions of the Crown of Aragon, the judges had to make references to the usages of Barcelona, but also at the Visigothic laws and to the Roman ones, right? And this makes sense because Barcelona was, of course, the bigger center, the most developed one, so the most complex, right, socially. So they had, with the usages, as we've seen for the first time, just at least drafted their own law for how it was already developed by that time. You could also refer to the Visigothic laws, meaning how they had historically been also applied in Spain, and the Roman ones, so the ones of the Justinian Code and of the Italian commentarists, right? So the same disposition can be found in the customs of Tárrega in 1242. However, there is another instance under James I of Aragon that, at least as a ruler, we discussed some days ago. Lots of Spanish stuff. It's completely random lately, but that's also normal statistically. In 1251 you have the Cortes gathering in Barcelona. At that point, the Aragonese king had a disposition approved, essentially forbidding the use of the Visigothic laws, of the Roman law, and of the canon ones, right? And this seems, of course, strange. I haven't actually understood well why this would have happened. I mean, it's as if he would have liked to homogenize the entire Aragonese crown's legal issues on the basis of the Barcelonian usages. And in fact, it seems that nobody really followed this injunction, right? The communities of the Crown of Aragon kept working like they had been doing. In fact, we find in the customs of Tortosa, a few years later, and in the ones of Horta of 1298 and the ones of Miravet in 1319, the explicit recognition and lawfulness, of course, to the use of the canon Roman law as well. And at the same time, you find the same Aragonese monarchs, in fact, going back on that previous issue of James I of 1251, right? Albeit fairly late in time. So showing, especially within the Crown of Aragon, that, as we stress, was particularly composite in its domains, and notoriously so, that the monarchy, as we explained the other day, had not really managed to create sort of a unitary state of sort, like Castile instead had succeeded in doing. In 1335, we find Alfonso IV of Aragon establishing as a requisite of the judges the studying of civil law for 5 years. So this was civil law, was re-enabling here, rehabilitating, of course, a Roman law, of course, as a also quite a standard here, because of course at least the royal judges were to be among the best. Roman law was pretty big, like what the standards, what was required to know by heart was immense, was enormous. It's something that today we're completely dehabituated to any level exercise in universities. For them it was instead necessary, also because they didn't have many other technical auxilia for that matter, and they had to make things work. Pain, wars, rebellion, political crisis, and more. in 1409, the Cortes gathered in Barcelona declared officially that canon Roman law was integrating part of the enforced law within the kingdom. And such declaration was stressed, again, much later, but still showing the continuity of it, in the Cortes of Barcelona of 1599. Yes, you heard it, the time of Philip II. The latter Cortes, however, distinguished between the two components of common law, establishing essentially that the royal judges would have had in first place to use the canon law and only in a second moment the Roman one. I'm honestly not particularly familiar with early modern legal traditions, especially the ones of Spain, but I assume that this was based on the great power that the church had in Spain, the fact that still the system remained a very oligarchic one, so there wasn't much of an interest to push the subjects towards sort of the greater autonomy that Roman law really offered, like talking, say, person-to-person business affairs, but this is just my guess. So there was a resistance towards Roman law, in fact, also in Castile, in spite of all, right? In 1348, this happens probably for the same reasons of Aragon, and in times of troubles like the mid-14th century. In fact, it's not a surprise that in 1348, right, not a random date, the Cortes of Alcalá established that the judges had to, first of all, avail themselves of the royal laws, so sticking to what, as we've seen, this sense that the king decided, in a broader sense, would do, and only eventually of the local fueros. Now, this is particularly interesting because it shows that, in spite of the fact, of course, every law is issued because it's normally infringed, or at least there is a problem that it's being attempted to be fixed, let's say, by the issuing of these laws. However, the monarchy had the confidence of claiming that the local customs were less important than what the king had issued, which is, again, in a traditional context, a mind-blowing idea. And as an extrema ratio, as an ultima ratio, they would have had to employ the ley de las siete partidas that would have not, say, would have provided with probably the last, in fact, resort, if both the royal laws that had the precedence and the local fueros would have not provided with the norms to apply as sources, right? And which tells you, of course, also how justice was administered. I mean, they literally had to be, there were these experts in law that had to know in the first place whether a specific context was disciplined. I mean, today we have a much more uniformly and sort of rigid, both in civil and in common law, right? The idea that, yes, there is a margin for interpretation. Law is very complex and complicated. Our societies are much more complex and complicated than those ones, but they're sort of much more certainly applicable for many reasons that I think are obvious to consider how our politics and societies differ from the ones of the time. So when you think about canon Roman law, you do not speak in these circumstances of the one that laws that the royal judges would have had to use, right? Their reception was mediated by the siete partidas, that, as we've seen, were essentially still part of a royal tradition, by the way. So this, together with royal law, sort of surrounded the fueros that were given some relevance, obviously enough, but still were in Castile at least less sort of, you see how it differs from Aragon, how much more rigid and authoritarian the system is. Not everything was coherent nor fully applicable, though, because the decision that we have observed here for Castile, the attempt of enforcing this organization, contrasts with a further deliberation of the same Cortes of Alcalá, according to which the royal judges had to be also experts in the libri legales, that were essentially the Roman law, right? How they had been reconstructed in the Middle Ages by the Bolognese tradition. This is particularly relevant deliberation because it shows, first of all, how spread Roman law was in Castile by this time. Again, we are in the mid-14th century. This is kind of obvious because, just again, Western Europe had basically drawn this by now as a general point of reference, and pretty much every jurist in Western Europe was studying that. And the teaching of Roman law was also very important in the same Studium Generalis of Salamanca. It was actually its principal saint. So of course you could not fully say, even these universities, yes, were established by the kings of Castile, but it's not that they were perfectly controllable systems, right? It's a bit like all the scandals that occurred at the theology faculty of Paris, right, in the heartland of the most Catholic Capetian monarchy. Things could always get out of hand to some degree, and especially considering the importance and the effectiveness that Roman law had been having pretty much everywhere, the preference for a relatively arbitrary royal law was not, enforceable with the coercive means of the mid-14th century, definitely. But it was an attempt. It was, again, a way that had set in as a mentality of the Castilian kings and the confidence of their rule. What we just talked about was the second deliberation of the Cortes of Alcalá that would be further confirmed later on, after at least the dynastic union, which is not the national union, remember that, nor the royal union of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, in the Pragmatic of Barcelona of 1493, with which, in fact, the Reyes Católicos imposed to the royal judges in Spain to certify their attendance to the classes of civil and canon law for at least 10 years in a general studium. Right, naturally there were many studia, many universities in Spain at the time. 10 years. Right, consider that a doctor with a specialization today takes 8 years to study. These guys had to study 10 years to properly to attend the lessons in civil and canon law in order to become royal judges in the first place. Talking of standards, this rule was further reinforced in the Instruction of 1500. Right. What is more interesting, however, is that apparently the contrast between the royal direction and the juridical tradition was not the juridical autonomy in many ways, right? Because these Spanish lawyers were updating themselves, right? Is the exclusion of Roman and canon law from the sources to which the judges had to make reference, repeated in 1505 by the Leyes de Toro. And it does make sense in many ways, because at this point the dynastic unification of Spain was still very far from being, again, a national union of sort. Spain was basically, the greatest, if not, like, maybe just after France, the most powerful realm in Europe, right? Individually, talking just about the Spanish mainland and isles, and yet it was, in virtue of this enormity, still very divided, right? Were issues still like the difficulties in homogenizing, for example, the Christian population. I mean, it was still full of Muslims, of Jews in enormous proportions, like compared to other countries, and this brought to expulsions, to rebellions, to like a lot of territorial issues. Like the local communities were still to some extent existing. There were attacks from external. Still, the Ottomans would fuel those same Moriscos rebellions. But in general, the Spanish state was new, right? The full direction, for example, of the papal of the Spanish Church by the Pope was something fairly recent, right? The only unitary institution that had existed in Spain up to that point was the Inquisition, right? So it was very important from the side of the Reyes Católicos to enforce a type of law that was mostly referring to the royal issues. This was a warranty of, again, of greater unity and compactness that was desperate, necessary, even with these very harsh measures. However, there wasn't so much that could be done as far as the continuation of the canon Roman law teaching in the same Spanish universities, and also its application in the legal forum, the doctrinal interpretation. I mean, at this point, Spain was within the broader European Renaissance. It was just connected ever more, also internationally. Think about in Italy, in Flanders, and now, the New World had been found, colonized, and so there were enormous needs of Spanish involvement, of update, but at the same time an internal regulation was needed within the Iberian Peninsula, because that was the actual mainland from which the government operated, and without a tight control on that, the entire system would have been shattered. So all this makes sense, right? In the general studia, besides Salamanca, you have at this time Valladolid and Alcalá. Next to the Roman and canon law, also and unavoidably, royal law was studied, right? This was, again, what the monarchs were pushing for. They had been around for centuries. You must learn that if you wanted to become a lawyer. There was a reservation for the lectura extraordinaria, dedicated specifically to the Ley de las Siete Partidas. This is true also for the ordinances of the Kingdom of Castile, the newer Leyes de Toro, as we've seen, issued at the beginning of the 16th century, right? So this was all made in the effort of also modernizing further Spain, but through its own peculiar direction in this important monarchic dirigism, interventism, like in the juridical field, we can so say. And so, from the norms of these texts, the teachers, the juridical, the doctors of law, stressed their rooting in the sacred scriptures, in canon law, and in the Justinian compilation, right? So the Bible as also essentially natural law, God's law, ecclesiastical law, and the Roman one, right? So To make the long story short, also to get a more concrete essence of this picture, also within the Iberian kingdoms, canon Roman law was the enforced law, right? It was, as we've seen, traditionally the foundation of the fueros and the source of framing of the royal customs within the categories elaborated by doctrine, right? In many ways, this was similar to what was happening in Italy, right? And in fact, if we look even at a broader scope, the Mos Italicus, about which I made a video, so basically the continuation of the Bolognese doctrine and the way Italians essentially stuck the most to Roman law during the Renaissance, continued to inform the same Spanish doctrine, right? And for also the obvious reason that this is the beginning of the Spanish hegemony over Italy, right? And in fact, there is a very eloquent episode here that is the pragmatic sanction issued in 1559 by the King of Spain, Philip II, who, in forbidding to the Spanish students to go studying in any other university outside the Iberian kingdoms, he admitted as sole exceptions the studia of Bologna, Rome, Naples, and Coimbra in Portugal, where the traditional address, right, of just set within the same Spain was very tightly followed, right? That's how much the similarity actually between the Mos Italicus and the Mos Hispanicus, even though this is a term that hasn't developed in historiography, really emerged. And obviously enough, because at this point the Habsburgs in Spain, in the Empire, we've seen it also in the video about this Roman law in Germany, the closer they were to the Catholic world, to the papacy, to what were actually still the most advanced parts of Europe, stuck to the Mos Italicus as well, and Roman law as much as they could, right? Especially those countries like Germany that had a myriad of local customs that were driving, the state builders crazy because of the heterogeneity of these norms. So here you have, of course, Bologna and Rome that are part of the Papal States. So these are not ruled by the Spanish, even though they're signing mostly with them. Naples, then instead, is a Spanish vice realm. Coimbra in Portugal are the essentially the places where it was okay, like for the Spanish to attend the local legal studies, the classes, and of the studia, because in Spain they were perfectly fine with the Mos Italicus, and essentially was functional to their own national juridical needs, right, for the Spanish state and how it was taking form gradually. There was truly a Mos Hispanicus as far as the Spanish jurists contributed in an original way to the interpretation of the Justinian and canon texts, committing themselves in their conciliation of local law, but in the function, of course, of the correct application in forensic activity. Among the jurists of the 16th century, we can remember Gregorio Lopez, Antonio Gomez, and Rodrigo Suarez. Right. So when you look at these guys, their work, you realize that Spanish doctrine was also open, actually, to the solicitations of humanistic culture broadly meant. There was also in Spain a Renaissance. There was a further not just declension to the local Iberian needs, but probably a theoretical speculation, an international one, a European-wide one. And so what you can appreciate of this Spanish way is the particular sensitivity towards the philological problems, right? They cared about the classical, education, how, a tighter interpretation, like properly of the original Roman meaning. We've seen this in the Mos Gallicus, that was very sophisticated as far as this was concerned. You find, for example, in Antonio Augustin, such particular attention, especially as far as the canon texts were concerned. Also in Diego de Covarrubias. Here, perhaps just a minimal reference to the Portuguese doctrine is relevant. Portugal followed the Mos Italicus as well. We can remember Cristóbal de Costa, Heitor Rodriguez, Jorge de Cabedo, Pedro Barbosa, right? And you have also humanistic approaches, of course, in Portugal, in the vest of Luis Alvares Nogueira's work. This guy had been a pupil of Giovanni Andrea Alciato, that was a very famous Milanese jurist. Right, Milan, by the way, was, as you know, during the Italian Wars, taken over by the Spanish and ruled as, of course, one of the most, not actually the most important center, at least in what had been the Italic kingdom. Right, so you see here the Iberians also beveraging themselves to the highest springs of humanistic Italian law and legal interpretation. So there is really an incredible affinity, right, and especially interest from the Iberian side in getting as much as they could from this Renaissance cradle, right? And so we could, of course, talk a lot about how these phenomena blended together as far as also the politics of the single rulers is concerned, but I started this history of law series mostly for the sake of showing how medieval realms really worked, right? What were, of course, the most important juridical traditions and practice in the medieval millennium. We're coming to an end, frankly. There is something that we have mostly to refine as we enter the modern era, because technically I think it's very important to arrive until Napoleon, right? I don't say this randomly as much as I really mean when I say that there wasn't really a modern age, right? We passed straight from the Middle Ages to the contemporary era as far as juridical tradition is concerned, and the Code de Napoleon is definitely the watershed, and one must understand also what had been happening in Europe during the 17th century, the 18th. We talked a bit about that in other videos, but it's important also to realize quite deeply what, in fact, the roots of the same medieval juridical tradition really were. Because I've always had this aspect that the most difficult thing to understand in history, at least to teach, I see this in university, is properly adapting the contemporary mindset regarding the modern state and how it works today to how it actually was just up to a couple of centuries ago. It was actually the normality, right, as far as, you know, the like, it had always existed since the beginning of these juridical traditions. So I wouldn't simply let's say deny this as a topic on Schwerpunkt. I think we must discuss it. I see people watching sometimes timidly this content, but overall I think it's interesting because it does, I make at least this history a matter of statehood, right? A matter of politics, a matter of institutions. Of course, of broader culture, because you understand here, for example, where Spain was coming from, right? With a also very externally receptive context, right? Because it's as if like when the Reconquista took over what was in fact the majority of Spain, like everything had to be sort of redrawn. You know, you could have here the Castilian case is incredibly exemplificative. There was a Visigothic law that was virtually Roman in nature, surviving, of course, within the Islamic world, but in ways that were so different and in a way so outdated to the extent that, of course, the major contribution had to happen mostly from the juridical tradition of the broader West, and ending up to overlap basically with the Mos Italicus, with Italian juridical tradition. This is particularly important, and the attempt, especially as we've seen here in the Renaissance, to maintain a royal guidance, a royal direction. This is deeply felt in Spain because of the incredible diversity of traditions that existed as far as especially politics and institutions really were between Castile and Aragon, just to say the most macroscopic evidence. But again, the absence of any other previous unitary institution in Spain, which is crazy if you think about it, because it's such a powerful and large country for how it was becoming, also in a unitary sense, towards the end of the Middle Ages, defected exactly of those tools. And so they had to quickly adapt that, and those who had to keep this together were, of course, the kings, with the enormous problems that they had managing this incredibly large, and again, not particularly homogeneous system, right? And it's a pity, like, we should talk much more about 15th century Spanish history. By the way, as I was saying before, in these last weeks we had a lot of Spanish history going on, but we haven't talked so much about it on Schwerpunkt overall, compared especially to one of other countries. But it's beautiful to see how, like, by talking about this and that every day, we manage to cover also some of the most relevant topics, and I hope that this is, of course, just the beginning. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.